The Suburban Nightmare. On the south shore of Long Island, just an hour's drive from New York City, lies Gilgo Beach, a narrow strip of sand bordered by marshland and the Atlantic Ocean. For years, it was considered an ordinary coastal retreat. Families vacationed there. Residents commuted into the city, and nothing about the neighborhood suggested the kind of darkness that was about to be uncovered. That perception shattered in December 2010, when Suffolk County police officers searching for a missing woman instead stumbled across a nightmare. Hidden in the dense brush along Ocean Parkway, investigators found the remains of 4 young women. Each discovery was only feet away from the next. Within days it was clear, this was not the work of chance or coincidence. Someone had been hunting and leaving bodies on the edge of Long Island's most unsuspecting community. The press quickly coined the term the Gilgo Four. Their names, Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, would become synonymous with a sprawling case that shook American suburbia. These were not nameless victims. They were daughters, sisters, women who had struggled and survived in life, only to be silenced by the same unseen predator. The discovery sparked one of the largest homicide investigations in New York history. Detectives searched miles of shoreline, digging deeper into the marshes and dunes, uncovering more victims as the months went on. By the summer of 2011, at least 10 sets of remains had been found in the area. Each case carried its own mystery, but together they painted the portrait of a calculated killer who had been operating for years. The community demanded answers. How could a serial predator leave so many victims along a major highway without being caught? Why had warnings gone unnoticed for so long? And what did this say about the ability or willingness of law enforcement to protect vulnerable women who worked on the margins of society? For years, progress was slow. Task forces were formed, leads ran cold, and families held vigils that blurred into anniversaries of loss. The case became a fixture in true crime circles, symbolizing both the persistence of evil and the limits of the justice system. It wasn't just about Gilgo Beach. It was about trust. Trust in police, trust in neighbors, and trust in the very idea that suburban America was safe. That trust collapsed further in July 2023, when police announced the arrest of a suspect, Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old married father of 2, a Manhattan architect with a thriving business, and a man who looked no different than any other homeowner in Massapequa Park. For years, he had lived among neighbors who waved to him on their morning walks, completely unaware that investigators would later accuse him of being the very monster they had feared for over a decade. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach murders, a case defined by chilling discoveries, investigative dead ends, and finally, a breakthrough that stunned the nation. It is a story about victims who should never be forgotten, and about the unsettling reality that sometimes the person we least suspect may be capable of unimaginable crimes. Discovery of the victims. On December 11, 2010, a Suffolk County police officer and his K-9 partner entered the thick brush along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. They weren't looking for murder victims. They were searching for Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman who had gone missing in May after placing a frantic 911 call. Gilbert's disappearance had drawn criticism toward the police, and this search was an attempt to retrace her last known steps in the marshland near the beach. Instead of finding Shannon, the officer's dog alerted to something concealed under the brambles. What emerged was a shocking discovery: the skeletal remains of a young woman, bound with burlap. The officer quickly radioed for backup. Within hours, a crime scene was secured, and the grim work of combing the area began. The following day, just yards away, investigators uncovered a second body, then a third, and then a fourth. The remains lay within a quarter-mile of one another, hidden but not deeply buried. The discovery was too precise, too deliberate. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer stood before cameras and confirmed what many feared. Long Island was dealing with a serial killer. The 4 victims were soon identified. Each woman was in her 20s. Each had been working as an escort advertising services online, and all had vanished between 2007 and 2010. Their names would become central to the case. Melissa Barthelemy, 24, disappeared in July 2009 after leaving her Bronx apartment. In the weeks following her disappearance, her family received a series of taunting phone calls traced to Long Island, in which a man mocked them about Melissa's fate. Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 25, from Connecticut, was last seen in July 2007. She had traveled to New York City for sex work but never returned. She was the earliest known victim among the group. Megan Waterman, 22, from Maine, vanished in June 2010 after leaving a Holiday Inn in Hauppauge, Long Island. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, of North Babylon, Long Island, disappeared in September 2010 after leaving her home to meet a client she had described to friends. The similarities between the cases were undeniable. All 4 women were petite, all were connected through Craigslist escort ads, and all had disappeared within a 3-year span. Investigators noted the burlap material used to wrap or conceal their remains, a detail suggesting planning and a single offender's signature. The news shocked the Long Island community. For years, Gilgo Beach had been a place for fishing, summer rentals, and family gatherings. Now it was a crime scene spanning miles of highway. Residents who once felt secure suddenly looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The press descended, labeling the unknown offender the Long Island serial killer, or LISK. Law enforcement responded by expanding the search area. Over the following months, investigators would uncover more remains, at least 6 additional victims scattered along Ocean Parkway and nearby Jones Beach. The scope of the crimes grew beyond what anyone expected. Some victims were linked to cases dating back nearly 15 years. But in those first weeks of discovery, it was the Gilgo Four who defined the investigation. Their disappearances showed a clear pattern, and police now had physical evidence, cell phone records, DNA samples, and the burlap fibers that could potentially connect a suspect. Yet despite the urgency, answers were elusive. The Suffolk County Police Department faced criticism for how slowly information was released. Families accused officials of downplaying the danger to sex workers. Detectives quietly admitted to the press that the killer was careful, using burner phones, avoiding surveillance, and choosing victims who were vulnerable and less likely to trigger immediate large-scale investigations. By early 2011, the Long Island community was left with an unsettling truth. A serial killer had been active for years, operating undetected in plain sight. The discovery of the Gilgo Four was not the end of the mystery, but the beginning of one of the most complex homicide investigations in New York State's history. The marshes of Gilgo Beach had given up their secret. Now the challenge for law enforcement was finding the man who had placed those women there and understanding how he had gotten away with it for so long. Shannon Gilbert. The catalyst. While the discovery of the Gilgo Four in December 2010 stunned the nation, it is important to remember that investigators were not even looking for those women when they entered the brambles of Ocean Parkway. They were searching for one woman, Shannon Gilbert. Shannon was a 24-year-old aspiring singer from New Jersey who worked as an escort to support herself. On the night of May 1, 2010, she traveled to Oak Beach, a private gated community just east of Gilgo, for a client appointment she had arranged online. Accompanied by her driver, she entered the home of Joseph Brewer, a local resident. Within hours, however, something went terribly wrong. At around 4:51 a.m., Shannon dialed 911. Her call lasted more than 20 minutes. On the recording, which would later be played for her family, she can be heard panicked, repeatedly telling the dispatcher, "They're trying to kill me." She fled Brewer's home, banging on neighbors' doors and begging for help, but disappeared into the marshland as the sun rose. Neither Brewer nor the driver was charged in connection to her disappearance. Despite the frantic call, Suffolk County Police did not immediately launch a large-scale search. Gilbert's work as an escort contributed to what her family and advocates argue was a slow, dismissive initial response. Months later, in December, when officers finally searched the area again, they uncovered not Shannon, but the 4 other women whose remains redefined the scope of the investigation. Shannon's case, however, did not fade. In December 2011, more than a year after her disappearance, police discovered her personal belongings, clothing, purse, and phone, in the marsh. Days later, her skeletal remains were found about half a mile from where she had last been seen alive. The official ruling on her death remains one of the most disputed aspects of the Gilgo Beach investigation. In 2012, the Suffolk County medical examiner concluded her death was likely the result of misadventure, possibly drowning in the marsh while disoriented. No clear signs of homicidal violence were identified in her remains. Police echoed this theory, suggesting she may have succumbed to the elements. Her family strongly disagreed. They pointed to her chilling 911 call, her desperate flight through Oak Beach, and the broader pattern of bodies nearby. In 2016, the family commissioned an independent autopsy by noted forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, who suggested Shannon's death could not be conclusively ruled accidental. He noted potential signs of strangulation, though the evidence was limited due to decomposition. For many advocates, Shannon became the symbol of how vulnerable women are often disregarded by law enforcement. Her case exposed flaws in how missing person reports, especially those involving sex workers, were prioritized. Her mother, Mari Gilbert, became a fierce public voice, insisting her daughter had been murdered and fighting for the truth until her own tragic death in 2016. Whether or not Shannon was killed by the same hand as the Gilgo Four, her disappearance was the spark that forced authorities to search Gilgo Beach. Without her 911 call, the killer's dumping ground might have remained hidden for years longer. In the larger story of the Long Island serial killer, Shannon Gilbert's name carries weight not just because of what happened to her, but because her case exposed the hidden dangers of Oak Beach and led directly to the discovery of a serial predator's hunting ground. Expansion of the investigations. When the first 4 victims were identified in December 2010, investigators and the public believed they might be dealing with a contained series of murders. That assumption collapsed almost immediately. In March and April 2011, Suffolk County Police widened their search along Ocean Parkway, extending beyond the original Gilgo Beach site. What they found revealed a much larger and older pattern of violence. First came the remains of Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old sex worker from Manhattan who had disappeared in July 2003. In fact, parts of her dismembered body had been discovered 8 years earlier in Manorville, Long Island. But her skull and additional bones were now located near Gilgo Beach. This link showed that the killer, or killers, had been active much longer than originally thought, and that they had used multiple dump sites. Soon after, investigators uncovered the remains of an unidentified woman known only as Peaches, nicknamed for a distinctive tattoo on her torso. Peaches had been found in 1997 in Hempstead Lake State Park, but now additional skeletal remains linked her case directly to the Gilgo investigation. The discovery suggested the killer's activity could date back well over a decade. Other remains included a toddler, later determined to be Peach's daughter, and another still unidentified woman known as Jane Doe No. 7. The presence of a child among the victims horrified the public and added a new dimension to the case. This was no longer just a cluster of young adult women. It was evidence of a predator, or possibly multiple predators, operating with chilling disregard for human life. By the summer of 2011, at least 10 sets of remains had been found across Gilgo Beach, Oak Beach, and Jones Beach Island. Theories multiplied. Was this the work of a single serial killer? Could multiple killers be using the same area to dispose of bodies? Police admitted they couldn't rule anything out. The FBI soon became formally involved, providing technical resources and criminal profiling. Phone records were re-examined, forensic evidence cataloged, and databases compared across jurisdictions. Still, the lack of clear suspects frustrated both investigators and families. Complicating matters, the investigation was marred by internal controversy within Suffolk County Police. Then Chief of Department James Burke was later convicted on unrelated federal charges of obstruction of justice, casting a shadow over the department's credibility. Critics accused the SCPD of deliberately resisting FBI assistance in the early years, slowing progress at a critical time. For families, each new discovery deepened the wound. Vigils were held, photos of victims lined the roadside, and relatives demanded accountability. They pointed out that many of the women had been dismissed by police when they first went missing because of their involvement in sex work. Now those warnings seemed tragically justified. Despite the frustration, one fact had become undeniable. The Gilgo Beach murders represented one of the largest serial investigations in New York history. What began as a search for a single missing woman had uncovered a burial ground stretching for miles. Yet even with multiple victims, patterns, and evidence, investigators remained stuck. By the end of 2011, no arrests had been made. Theories abounded in the media. Was the killer a police officer, a fisherman familiar with the area, or even someone living in Oak Beach itself? Documentaries and podcasts speculated, but concrete answers remained elusive. For the next decade, the investigation drifted in and out of headlines. But behind the scenes, technology was advancing. DNA analysis was improving. Cell tower records were being revisited, and new investigative eyes were preparing to re-examine the evidence. The discoveries of 2010 and 2011 had built the foundation. What remained was the painstaking task of identifying the killer who had haunted Long Island for years. The long stalemate. By the end of 2011, the Gilgo Beach murders had become one of the most infamous unsolved cases in the United States. 10 sets of human remains had been discovered across Long Island's southern shore, and at least 4 of the victims were linked by clear patterns. Yet despite the scope of the investigation, no arrests were made. For years, the case seemed trapped in neutral. Detectives followed leads, re-examined phone records, and interviewed dozens of potential suspects. But the killer's methods, using burner phones, targeting women who were often overlooked by society, and dumping remains in an area with limited surveillance, made progress painfully slow. This stagnation fueled speculation and mistrust. Families of the victims held vigils and press conferences, demanding accountability. They accused Suffolk County Police of negligence, pointing to how some victims' initial disappearance reports had been brushed aside because of their work in sex trade. Advocates argued that had these women been treated with the same urgency as others, the killer might have been caught sooner. The credibility of the investigation was further damaged by scandal inside the police department. In 2012, James Burke was appointed Suffolk County Police Chief. Instead of pushing the Gilgo case forward, Burke became embroiled in his own criminal conduct. In 2015, he was arrested and later sentenced to federal prison for assaulting a suspect and obstructing justice. His corruption case and his reported refusal to involve the FBI earlier in the Gilgo investigation cast a long shadow over law enforcement's handling of the murders. Meanwhile, public fascination only grew. The case became a staple of documentaries, podcasts, and true crime forums. Theories multiplied. Some believed the murders were the work of one highly organized serial killer. Others suspected multiple killers may have used the same area to dump victims. Online communities dissected every detail, from cell tower data to the victims' final phone calls. The lack of progress was not from lack of effort. Law enforcement quietly pursued new forensic techniques, including reanalyzing DNA samples as technology advanced. But these efforts were slow, and by the mid-2010s, the case seemed to be fading into cold case territory. For the families, time became a cruel wait. Each anniversary brought new reminders of the women lost and of justice still denied. Some family members passed away before seeing any resolution. Others continued to pressure officials, insisting that answers were possible if investigators truly committed the resources. By 2019, nearly a decade after the first bodies were discovered, the Gilgo Beach murders had taken on the aura of a modern American mystery, horrifying, unsolved, and haunted by the sense that the truth was just out of reach. But beneath the frustration, a quiet shift was beginning. A new generation of investigators, coupled with improved forensic tools, would soon reopen doors that had been closed for years. What seemed like a stalemate was, in fact, the long inhale before the case's biggest breakthrough. Breakthrough: DNA and cell phone evidence. After nearly 10 years of frustration, the Gilgo Beach murders received new life in 2020, when Suffolk County District Attorney Timothy Sinney and Suffolk Police Commissioner Geraldine Hart announced the creation of a multi-agency task force. The goal was simple but ambitious: re-examine every shred of evidence with modern forensic tools and fresh investigative eyes. This decision marked the first real progress in years. The task force quickly zeroed in on one of the killer's most chilling behaviors: the use of burner phones. In the days after Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009, her younger sister received a series of taunting calls from a man using prepaid phones. Investigators had long believed these calls were made from Midtown Manhattan, near the area where the suspect worked. Revisiting those phone records, the task force began mapping overlaps between the victims, cell data, and possible suspects living or commuting in the area. At the same time, forensic evidence from the victims' remains was reanalyzed. In particular, investigators focused on hair samples found on the burlap used to wrap Amber Costello's body. Previous testing had been inconclusive, but advances in mitochondrial DNA analysis provided new results. The hair was not a direct match to a suspect. It was consistent with a female relative of the killer. This was the break investigators needed. They began looking for Long Island men who lived near Gilgo Beach, worked in Manhattan, and had a wife or daughter whose mitochondrial DNA could explain the sample. That combination drastically narrowed the suspect pool. Attention quickly turned to Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park. He fit the profile almost too perfectly. A family man living less than 20 miles from Gilgo Beach, commuting daily to his Manhattan office. He owned multiple vehicles that matched witness descriptions, including a Chevrolet Avalanche, similar to one seen by neighbors around the time of Amber Costello's disappearance. Surveillance on Heuermann intensified. Investigators tracked his movements, collected trash, and monitored his behavior. In January 2023, the FBI followed him as he left his office in Midtown Manhattan and stopped at a pizza shop. He discarded a crust into a public trash can, seemingly insignificant, but for detectives, it was gold. The pizza crust was sent for testing. Results confirmed what the task force suspected. The DNA on the crust matched the male profile found on hair recovered from the Gilgo victims. It was a direct link between Rex Heuermann and the murders of at least 3 of the women. But the evidence didn't stop there. Cell tower data placed Heuermann's phone in the same areas as the victims' phones during critical time frames. Investigators also connected burner phones used to contact victims and their families to his known phone accounts. Combined, the digital and forensic trail built a compelling case. The picture that emerged was chilling. For years, Heuermann had lived an ordinary suburban life while allegedly carrying out horrific crimes. He was married with 2 children, a respected architect who dealt with corporate clients in Manhattan skyscrapers by day, and, prosecutors argued, a calculating predator by night. By mid-2023, the evidence was strong enough for authorities to move in. After more than a decade of unanswered questions, the task force finally had their man. The use of advanced forensic DNA testing and reanalyzed cell data represented the kind of breakthrough families had begged for. It wasn't new bodies or new witnesses that solved the case. It was technology and persistence applied to old evidence. The breakthrough underscored how far criminal investigations had come since 2010. What once felt like an untraceable killer leaving bodies in the brush was, in the end, a man undone by the smallest traces. A hair fragment on burlap and a discarded piece of pizza. Arrest of Rex Heuermann. On the morning of July 13, 2023, more than a decade after the discovery of the Gilgo Four, authorities finally moved in on their prime suspect. At approximately 8:30 a.m., FBI agents and Suffolk County detectives surrounded a man as he left his Midtown Manhattan office near Penn Station. His name was Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect, husband, and father of 2. To those who knew him professionally, he was a quiet but successful businessman. To prosecutors, he was the Long Island serial killer. The arrest stunned New York. Heuermann was not a drifter or a shadowy figure on the margins of society. He lived in Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood less than 20 miles from Gilgo Beach. His home, a modest red-sided house on First Avenue, sat on a tree-lined street where children rode bikes and families barbecued in the summer. He had lived there since childhood, raising his own family in the same home where investigators would soon uncover disturbing evidence. As news cameras rolled, officers cordoned off the block and began a massive search operation. Over 200 firearms were recovered, stored in safes throughout the house. Detectives removed computers, hard drives, and boxes of potential evidence. Neighbors watched as tents were erected in the yard, cadaver dogs combed the property, and investigators dug through the soil searching for remains or hidden items. The once quiet neighborhood transformed into the center of a national media storm. Inside his Manhattan office, investigators also seized business records and digital devices. Colleagues later described Heuermann as socially awkward but professional. He had worked on projects for major corporations, presenting himself as a meticulous and reliable architect. No one suspected that behind that exterior, prosecutors alleged, was a man responsible for some of Long Island's most notorious murders. The charges announced that day were explosive. Heuermann was indicted for the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He was also named the prime suspect in the killing of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, though formal charges for her case were still pending as investigators built additional evidence. Perhaps most shocking was the reaction of his family. His wife, Asa Ellerup, and their 2 children expressed complete disbelief. Prosecutors later emphasized that DNA linked to Asa had been found on evidence recovered with the victims, but authorities stressed that there was no indication she had any knowledge of the crimes. The family quickly filed for divorce, with Ellerup later describing the horror of learning her husband had been leading a double life. Neighbors echoed that disbelief. To them, Rex was a quiet man who kept to himself, sometimes seen walking to the train for his commute. The idea that he could be connected to a string of murders stretching back over a decade was almost impossible to reconcile with the man they thought they knew. The arrest marked the first tangible moment of justice for families who had waited years for answers. Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney addressed the press, emphasizing the painstaking work of the task force. "This is the beginning of the case against Mr. Heuermann, not the end. The investigation continues, but today we have taken a significant step toward justice for these victims and their families." For the families, it was a moment of bittersweet vindication, relief that someone had finally been arrested, but grief that it had taken so long, and that the man accused had lived comfortably just miles away the entire time. The ordinary suburban architect was gone. In his place stood an accused serial predator, one of the most notorious suspects in New York's modern criminal history. Inside the double life. The arrest of Rex Heuermann stunned his neighbors not only because of the charges, but because of how completely ordinary he seemed. To most people, he was a husband, a father, and an architect who kept to himself. Yet investigators allege that behind this facade was a man leading a secret life defined by predatory behavior, violent fantasies, and meticulous planning. By day, Heuermann worked as a licensed architect in Manhattan. His firm, RH Consultants and Associates, handled projects for major clients ranging from office towers to retail spaces. Colleagues described him as eccentric but professional, an older man with thick glasses, a deep voice, and a reputation for strict attention to detail. He commuted daily on the Long Island Railroad, blending in with thousands of other suburban professionals. At home in Massapequa Park, he lived with his wife, Asa Ellerup, and their 2 children. Neighbors occasionally saw him tending to the property, walking to the train, or running errands. No one reported unusual activity. His life appeared routine, even dull, exactly the kind of camouflage that allowed him to avoid suspicion for years. But investigators say the mask slipped once they began examining his digital footprint. Court filings revealed that Heuermann had used burner phones to arrange meetings with sex workers, and that he had conducted disturbing internet searches. Prosecutors described thousands of queries involving violent pornography, torture, and serial killer documentaries. Some searches even involved updates on his own case, an indication that he was monitoring media coverage about the Gilgo Beach murders. One detail that shocked the public was the arsenal of firearms found in his home. More than 200 guns were cataloged, including rifles, shotguns, and handguns. While not illegal, the sheer volume suggested a man who was deeply invested in control and intimidation. Alongside the weapons, investigators seized boxes of materials, including what prosecutors suggested could be trophies or items tied to his crimes. Equally unsettling was how seamlessly he compartmentalized this side of himself. His wife and children were reportedly away at times when prosecutors believed the murders occurred. Asa's DNA was detected on one of the victim's remains, but investigators explained this as transfer DNA, most likely from shared household objects such as hairbrushes or bedding. Officials emphasized she had no involvement, yet the discovery illustrated how close the victim's final traces were to Heuermann's family life. Psychologists often note that serial offenders like Heuermann are adept at leading double lives. Outwardly, they maintain jobs, families, and appearances of stability. Privately, they nurture violent fantasies and construct systems of control that allow them to act on them undetected. In Heuermann's case, prosecutors argue his careful use of burner phones, his knowledge of surveillance blind spots, and his calculated targeting of vulnerable women demonstrate this duality. For neighbors, the revelation was deeply unsettling. Many had lived near the Heuermann family for decades. Children had walked past his house daily on their way to school. One neighbor described the home as creepy-looking, but said no one imagined it was the residence of an accused serial killer. Others expressed horror that such violence could be planned in a neighborhood they considered safe. The image of Rex Heuermann as a respected architect and family man now stood in stark contrast to the profile of a sadistic predator. This tension, the outward normalcy and the alleged hidden brutality, became the central theme of media coverage. True crime audiences were drawn to the unsettling reality that sometimes the most ordinary face in the crowd conceals the darkest secrets. For investigators, the double life explained how Heuermann evaded suspicion for so long. He wasn't the stereotypical drifter or outcast. He was the man next door, the one who seemed to belong. And that, perhaps, was the most chilling revelation of all. Legal proceedings and evidence unfolding. When Rex Heuermann was taken into custody in July 2023, Suffolk County prosecutors wasted no time laying out the charges. He was indicted for the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, 2009, Megan Waterman, 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, 2010. He was also named the prime suspect in the killing of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 2007, though at first prosecutors withheld formal charges as they built additional evidence. The case quickly moved into the courts, with Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney emphasizing that this was only the beginning. Tierney described a careful years-long operation that tied Heuermann to the victims through a web of forensic evidence, cell phone data, and witness accounts. The cell phone evidence formed one of the strongest pillars of the prosecution. Records showed burner phones used to contact the victims were later connected to Heuermann's personal devices and accounts. Some of the calls taunting Melissa Barthelemy's family had even been placed from areas near his office in Midtown Manhattan. Combined with cell tower pings that placed his devices in the vicinity of victims' disappearances, the digital trail was difficult to ignore. The DNA evidence added even more weight. Hair samples found on burlap wrapping Amber Costello's remains matched mitochondrial DNA consistent with Heuermann's wife, Asa Ellerup, explained by prosecutors as transfer DNA from objects in the family's home. More crucially, a male hair found on the same burlap was linked directly to Heuermann through the discarded pizza crust collected in January 2023. This became the prosecution's smoking gun, connecting him physically to the bodies for the first time. In addition, vehicle evidence placed him in the frame. Witnesses had described a dark Chevrolet Avalanche parked outside Costello's house on the night she vanished. Records showed that Heuermann owned a Chevrolet Avalanche at the time, aligning with the description. Court documents also revealed disturbing search histories recovered from his digital devices. Prosecutors alleged he had spent years consuming violent pornography, researching serial killers, and even following news coverage of the Gilgo Beach investigation. They argued this behavior supported a pattern of sadistic interest and premeditation. Despite the mounting evidence, Heuermann's defense team pushed back aggressively. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his lawyers insisted that the case was circumstantial. They challenged the DNA findings, arguing that transfer DNA is not definitive proof and that contamination could not be ruled out. They also criticized the reliance on cell tower data, noting that coverage areas are wide and not always precise. Meanwhile, the court proceedings became a media spectacle. Each time Heuermann appeared in the Riverhead courthouse, family members of the victims filled the gallery, some holding photos of their loved ones. Outside, reporters documented every development, from legal motions to the reactions of Heuermann's estranged family. The case grew more complex in early 2024 when prosecutors filed additional charges formally accusing Heuermann of the murder of Maureen Brainard-Barnes. With that, he now faced 4 counts of murder tied directly to the Gilgo Four. Authorities also confirmed that investigations were ongoing into several of the other victims discovered in the wider Ocean Parkway search area. As of mid-2025, Heuermann remains in custody at the Suffolk County Jail, held without bail. His trial is still pending, and legal experts expect it to be one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent New York history. The prosecution plans to lean heavily on the forensic and digital evidence, while the defense will likely attempt to sow doubt about chain of custody, DNA reliability, and the possibility of multiple offenders. For the families, every hearing is another painful reminder. Yet, for the first time in over a decade, there is hope that the women whose remains were discovered in the brush near Gilgo Beach may finally have their day in court. The victims and families. The Gilgo Beach case has been told largely through the lens of police work, forensic evidence, and the man accused of the crimes. But at its heart, this story is about the victims. Young women whose lives ended too soon, and the families who have spent years demanding justice. Melissa Barthelemy, 24. Melissa was the first of the Gilgo Four to disappear, vanishing in July 2009 after leaving her Bronx apartment. She dreamed of becoming a hairdresser and had recently moved to New York City, supporting herself through escort work. When she failed to contact her family, they knew something was wrong. Their worst fears were confirmed weeks later when Melissa's teenage sister began receiving terrifying phone calls from a man using Melissa's phone. He mocked the family, described their daughter's final moments, and cruelly taunted them with graphic detail. Investigators traced the calls to Midtown Manhattan, near Rex Heuermann's office. For Melissa's mother and sister, those phone calls became a torment that lasted long after her death, and a chilling piece of evidence for prosecutors. Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 25. The earliest known victim of the Gilgo Four, Maureen disappeared in July 2007 after traveling from Connecticut to New York City. A mother of 2, she had fallen on difficult times financially and began working as an escort through Craigslist ads to support her children. Friends described her as fun-loving and fiercely devoted to her kids. When she vanished, her family was left without answers for years, not knowing her fate until her remains were discovered 3 years later. Her sister has since spoken publicly about the injustice of how long it took for Maureen's case to be taken seriously, given her circumstances. Megan Waterman, 22. Megan was from Scarborough, Maine. She was described as strong-willed, funny, and protective of her younger siblings. In June 2010, she traveled to Long Island with her boyfriend and was last seen leaving a hotel in Hopoge. She left behind a 3-year-old daughter who would grow up never knowing her mother. For Megan's family, the discovery of her remains brought crushing grief. But her sister and mother have remained outspoken advocates for justice, determined to keep her memory alive and her case in the public eye. Amber Lynn Costello, 27. Amber grew up on Long Island and was known for her outgoing personality and sharp wit. She battled addiction, but was working to rebuild her life. In September 2010, she left her home in North Babylon after arranging to meet a client. That was the last time she was seen alive. Friends later told investigators that Amber had described a man she felt uneasy about, a man who allegedly drove a Chevrolet Avalanche. That detail would become a key piece of evidence tying Rex Heuermann to her disappearance. For Amber's loved ones, the pain of losing her was compounded by knowing she may have sensed the danger but went anyway, trying to survive day to day. The families fight. For more than a decade, the families of these women became the driving force that kept the Gilgo case alive. They held vigils on Long Island's South Shore, carried photos of their daughters and sisters to press conferences, and demanded that law enforcement treat the victims as more than statistics. Melissa's sister Amanda has spoken about the haunting trauma of receiving those phone calls from the killer. Megan's family traveled from Maine to attend court hearings, standing outside the Suffolk County Courthouse holding her photo. Maureen's relatives emphasized that she was more than her circumstances. She was a mother whose children deserved to know what happened. Amber's friends described her as someone who loved deeply, even when her life was difficult. Advocates often point out that many of the victims in the Gilgo case were sex workers, women society too often disregards. Their disappearances were not initially treated with urgency, and their families had to fight against stigma to get attention for their cases. That reality has fueled criticism of how law enforcement prioritizes missing persons, particularly those from vulnerable communities. For the families, the arrest of Rex Heuermann brought some relief, but also fresh pain. It confirmed what they had feared, that their loved ones were killed deliberately, not lost to accident or chance. Yet justice remains incomplete until the trial delivers answers. In the end, the Gilgo Four are remembered not just as victims of a serial killer, but as daughters, sisters, and mothers whose lives had meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Their families continue to honor them by speaking their names, ensuring that the women remain at the center of the story. Wider impact on true crime and justice. The Gilgo Beach murders are not just a story about one man's alleged crimes. They've become a case study in the way society, law enforcement, and media confront violence against vulnerable women. The impact has rippled far beyond Long Island, raising questions that continue to resonate across the United States. One of the most significant issues exposed by the case is law enforcement's handling of missing persons who are sex workers. Several of the victims had been reported missing years before their remains were discovered. Families described how their pleas were initially dismissed or minimized because their loved ones were involved in sex work. Advocates argue this delay gave the killer more time to operate. In the aftermath, the Gilgo case has fueled national discussions about bias in policing and the need for equal urgency regardless of a victim's background. The case also highlighted the power of forensic technology. For years, the investigation stalled because available tools couldn't provide definitive answers. The eventual breakthrough, mitochondrial DNA from hair, matched via discarded pizza crust, showed how advances in testing can change everything. Today, law enforcement agencies across the country emphasize preserving even the smallest pieces of evidence, knowing that new technology might unlock answers years later. Beyond the courtroom, the Gilgo murders transformed into a fixture of true crime media. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative series brought the case to global attention, ensuring it never faded completely into cold case status. While this exposure kept pressure on authorities, it also sparked debates about ethics in true crime storytelling. Were these shows honoring victims or sensationalizing tragedy? For the families, media attention was both a double-edged sword, painful to relive, but necessary to keep the women's names in the public eye. The arrests in 2023 also revived a familiar but unsettling theme: the hidden predator. The idea that someone like Rex Heuermann, an architect, husband, father, could live undetected for so long struck a nerve. It challenged the stereotype of the serial killer as a loner or outsider. Instead, the Gilgo case reminded the public that danger can hide behind the most ordinary appearances, in the house next door, or in the man commuting beside you on the train. Politically, the case reshaped local law enforcement accountability. The scandals that plagued Suffolk County Police during the early years, particularly under Chief James Burke, served as a cautionary tale of what happens when agencies resist outside help. The eventual success of the multi-agency task force, which combined local police, state police, the FBI, and the district attorney's office, underscored the value of cooperation. Finally, the Gilgo case has become a touchstone in discussions about justice delayed. For more than a decade, families waited with little progress. That long wait is part of what makes the eventual breakthrough so significant. It demonstrates both the failures and resilience of the justice system. The wider impact of Gilgo Beach is clear. It is more than a local tragedy. It is a story about how society values victims, how justice is pursued, and how even the most hidden crimes can eventually be dragged into the light. Conclusion: justice in progress. More than a decade after the discovery of 4 young women in the brambles of Gilgo Beach, the case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved now stands on the threshold of resolution. The arrest of Rex Heuermann has brought families one step closer to answers, but it has not erased the pain, nor has it fully resolved the mystery of how so many lives were taken without accountability for so long. As of mid-2025, Heuermann remains in custody, charged with the murders of 3 women and formally accused in a 4th. Prosecutors have built their case on DNA evidence, cell tower records, vehicle history, and disturbing digital footprints. His defense maintains his innocence, preparing to challenge every piece of evidence in a trial that promises to be one of the most closely watched in New York's history. For the families, this period is bittersweet. Justice is finally within reach, but the years of waiting cannot be undone. Parents, siblings, and children endured anniversaries without closure. Some family members passed away before seeing the arrest. Others continue to attend court hearings, holding photographs of their loved ones, making sure the women remain the center of the story. The case is not entirely closed. Questions remain about other sets of remains discovered along Ocean Parkway, victims who have not yet been conclusively tied to Heuermann or to any other suspect. Law enforcement acknowledges that the investigation continues, leaving open the possibility that the true scope of the crimes is even larger than currently known. What the Gilgo Beach case demonstrates is both the fallibility and resilience of the justice system. It highlights how bias and institutional failure can delay progress, but also how persistence, technology, and public pressure can eventually force the truth into the open. The long stalemate was a source of anger and despair, yet it set the stage for breakthroughs that were possible only because investigators refused to give up. For the public, the case is a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers of ordinary life. A man who seemed like any other commuter, any other neighbor, is now accused of being one of the most prolific killers in Long Island's history. The story resonates because it disrupts the comfortable idea that danger is far away. Sometimes it lives just across the street. And yet, this is also a story about resilience. Families who refused to be silent. Investigators who returned to evidence others had set aside. Communities that kept asking questions. In the end, the Gilgo Beach murders will be remembered not just for the horror of the crimes, but for the determination to bring those responsible to justice. The case remains in progress, unfinished, ongoing, still unfolding. But for the first time in more than a decade, there is hope that the women who became known as the Gilgo Four will not be remembered as unsolved mysteries, but as lives honored through truth, accountability, and justice.